So the story starts with Matt Barcom introducing us to each other. And he said that we should meet because we have something in common. And once we started to discuss what we had in common, we realized that there's a lot.
It's a
We
lot.
both, yeah, we both care a lot about helping teams succeed, but also we had a lot of discussion around how to help teams understand concepts and what are the ways that we can help people understand. And just today I came across a quote: if you tell me, I will forget; if you show me, I will remember; if you let me do it, I will understand. And I think that is a very profound truth. I wanted to start by discussing your thing that you built, this curious duck simulation. Can you just give us a very short intro on what it is?
Sure. So it is a simulation of work flowing through an organization, and the underlying engine, you can think of it like a game engine. It allows for different configurations of teams and backlogs and priorities and different workflows where maybe there's a delay between here and here, or another delay between here and here. And there's the notion of a deployment, and deployments can have bugs and can have underlying reliability problems. And there can be customers who encounter those problems. But at the end of the day, it is a simulation of work flowing through a system that allows you to tweak different configurations and then see what happens as a result.
The really interesting thing about it, that what I really like, is that it helps people understand some uncomfortable truths. I think one of the first simulations I saw you did was around defects and their impact on the team's performance, and prioritizing defects in the front or in the back. And the quote that I really like there, and it kind of stuck with me, is that when you have a team with a fragile code base, the first thing you can do is put time pressure on that. And that is one of the uncomfortable truths that I think a lot of managers should hear. But can you elaborate a bit more on what is happening in that video, just very shortly?
Oh, sure. In the video, what we see is a scenario that I built in the simulation, and the system has underlying reliability problems, which increases the odds of bugs coming up. And the thing about pressure is, in the simulation, I mean, this part's just math. When a developer in the simulation is under pressure, they will work faster. However, they produce lower quality stuff. And so there's then a probability that bugs will occur as the lower probability, or the lower reliability, means there's a higher probability of bugs, which means that there's more bugs coming into the system, which means that the feature work slows down. That all is math in the engine. However, it felt so real when I was building it, because I lived that in the real world. And it was one of those cases where when I started running the simulation scenario that I had built, I had flashbacks to previous projects that I worked on. It just felt so realistic.
Yeah, yeah. I think what's really nice in your video is that first you show that people's intuition is right as long as the word is perfect. And I think that's such an important point, because a lot of the things that we see in software development don't work, but are intuitive, are usually not working because the word is more complex than we imagine it to be.
It's true. And with so many side effects. I mean, so part of where my simulation came out of was my fascination with systems thinking. And the thing about systems thinking is, if you start looking at the whole and all of the interrelated forces within an organization or a situation, the unintended consequences, where you do a thing that looks like there should be a direct causality. I do X, we get result Y. Cause and effect should be very straightforward. But there were side effects of the action, and the end result is that the outcome is the opposite, the boomerang effect of what you intended. I wanted to build a simulation that would allow for exploring those kinds of side effects without having to go through 9 months of attempting to do something different in an organization. And then at the end, discovering that, whoops, we reorged for greater efficiency. And the end result was that we actually are going slower than we ever did before, right? Those kinds of side effects. Our intuition can work linearly, but not with very complex systems that you can't reason about.
And that's kind of also ties in well with why I built Limp Poker specifically, right? Because the motivation there was to create an environment in which people can experiment quicker, where we create a situation where the feedback loop for the team on how we work, what is our process of working, the feedback loop on that is just much, much faster so that you get, like, you find out if your process is wrong much sooner. And that's why it kind of ends up shortening the time it takes for teams to learn a new concept or to improve on their processes, because otherwise the same amount of learning that usually happens in that 8 hours of a lean poker, that usually happens over months or even a year in normal life.
Totally. And going back to the original quote that you started us off with, that if you experience it, then you'll understand it. That visceral feeling that you get when you have those super fast feedback cycles, when you do a thing and see what happens, and that is not separated by very far in time, there's a feeling that you can't explain to somebody who's never felt it before. So you can read all the books and you can theoretically understand why it works, but that feeling of tremendous satisfaction of I did a thing and I can see the impact of that thing, it's addictive. And so this is what I love about lean poker, is that it gives people that opportunity to get addicted to that feeling and then seek it out in the much more complicated real world situation that they find themselves in, where they can't just, like, it's literally impossible to just get that feeling right away, but they can at least get closer because they know what it feels like and they know they need it.
Yeah, that's the idea.
So cool.
And what are some uncomfortable truths that you think people should also hear that were coming out of your simulations?
But we're aiming for 5 uncomfortable truths,
Mm.
right? And if uncomfortable truth number 1 is that putting pressure on developers who are working in a fragile system is the worst thing you can do because it's going to become more fragile, I think that that leads to uncomfortable truth number 2, which is that for people in a management position where they think their job is to manage the people or the organization or the process, you actually can't control a system. You can shape a system, you can shape a culture, but you cannot control a system. And that is a hard truth for someone who wants to be able to think in terms of, well, I'm in a position of authority. It is literally in my job title. I get to manage this thing. So therefore, by managing it, I can control it, right? Turns out not, because that's not how systems work. And I was just reading, actually, I don't know if it's okay to go here, but I'm going to anyway. I was just reading up on SAFE, which I'll be honest, I don't actually know much about beyond the very superficial reading that I had previously done and seeing the diagram that shows all the things that are under the SAFE umbrella, the Scaled Agile Framework, SAFE. And I was reading their little thing about systems thinking. And there was this heading level thing that said, basically, only management can change the system. And I had this visceral reaction of, oh, buddy, that is not how any of this works. It's absolutely true that if you're in a position of management, you have the authority to make policy. You presumably have some budget. You get to decide what hiring looks like. So you have an unfair advantage. Your thumb is on the scale. You absolutely have more ability to shape the system than someone who doesn't have that kind of authority. But every single actor within a system affects the system. That's how systems work. And so as a manager, you can't control your system. You can shape it. And you're not going to be able to shape it effectively if you can't see all of the ways in which the system is being affected, which means that if you think the only thing that's affecting the system is your policies, like your hiring policies or your hiring process or the budget or where we put money, if you think that's the only thing that's changing the system, you're not going to be able to shape it very effectively. So I guess that's uncomfortable truth number 2 is you can't control the system.
Yes, yes, and
Yes, and? Ooh, I can't wait. What's coming?
I had a discussion this morning with someone about how can you introduce agile? Do you introduce it top down or bottom up? And this
Yes.
person was arguing that you can only introduce agile top down. And the reasoning was like, if you are in a position of authority, then you get to make policy and then you get to like influence the system, which is fine. That is true. But that works really well if what you're doing is mechanical or repeatable. You can optimize the hell out of factory workers. Even there, I would argue that Taylorism is not the best way to go, but Taylorism works more or less for factory work. The minute you have creative work, you cannot optimize the hell out of what people do. So you actually have to get the buy-in of people. You actually have to convince people about the mindset that is agile, about the mindset that is DevOps. And we can label these things. The problem with labels is that people mean different things under the same label. But the point that I want to make is that these kinds of processes, the way we work, is something that everyone needs to buy into. So I would argue to change how a team works, change it to agile or name it whatever you like, to change this mindset, you actually need the buy-in from every person at the bottom of the system. So to create that change from the bottom up by first convincing your peers about a new way of working, and then you together convincing management is much, much easier than for a manager to convince everyone in an organization. Because from a position of authority, whatever you suggest is always going to be less authentic than from a peer.
I think that's fair. I do think that at a certain point, you do have to have the support of the people who control policy and budget.
Sure.
Because if they don't support you, then they're going to create incentives that incentivize the other behavior. And that will cause, you might have a small group of people who work together incredibly well and who have their own little subculture, but that subculture is now surrounded by all of the other groups that they have to interoperate with who are incentivized to follow whatever the old practices were, the old hierarchy or the old whatever the thing that group is trying to influence through the rest of the organization. So I think that the agile transformations that I saw that were wildly effective had both. They had people at the individual contributor layer who have their hands on the keyboard and are doing the work, right? Those people ultimately control what happens in the organization because they're doing the work and everybody else is talking about the work. But you also have to have the, well, it's true, but you also have to have the support of people who have the authority to change policy, incentive structures, and have budget to make stuff happen.
Yeah.
And where it starts, I don't actually care. It can start here and convince them. It can start here and convince them. It can start in both places. That's probably the most effective. Like there's this little rogue group that's been trying to do agile for a long time. And finally, the actual like catalyst is a new group of people at the leadership layer who have the ability to affect policy. And so they start seeing, oh, look, things are changing. And now we've got whoosh, it's like lightning. They find each other. It's great.
I wanted to come back to one of your simulations, which is for me uncomfortable fact number 3. And that has to do with resource utilization. And I really hate when people use the word resource when it comes to employees, because hey, I'm not a resource, I'm a human being. But but if we go with that phrase, even then, what are your thoughts on resource utilization?
So I think probably where you saw this was the very, very first video that I did, which was generalists versus specialists. And in that scenario, one of the little situations that I created was where, okay, we got the experts. They're the super experts. They're super fast at this very specific type of work. And they're going to wait to pick up that kind of work. They don't do anything outside their specialty. So they're going to wait until there is work there. And as soon as management sees very, very expensive specialists sitting around waiting for work, well, that can't be. We can't let that happen. They're idle. We must use all of that time that is available. They could be doing something else. And so now they start getting these other assignments that are not part of the project that they're on. And in the real world, I've totally seen this where you get the specialist, whether it's the data scientist or the person who's super amazing at optimizing the thing, whatever it is, like somebody who's a super specialist, and they sort of parachute into the team for a short period of time. And then when there's no more work for them to do, they're off to do something else. But in the meantime, more work comes in like that for that team. And so this is a local optimization problem where the manager is looking at this person and saying, I must keep this person busy all the time. The end result of that is the outcome takes so much longer, because now instead of the person waiting for work, which is
The
bad
work is
enough,
waiting
like
for the
that's
person.
exactly, yes, the work is waiting for the person. And so the manager thinks that they're doing the right thing for the organization by optimizing the utilization of that person's time, and the end result is so much worse for the organization because the value can't get delivered as quickly as it otherwise would. And
Mm.
making that mindset shift, it's so hard for people because it goes against the grain. People thinking, well, but they're wasting time. Time is the only thing, it's the only non-renewable resource that there actually really is. We can't waste their time. Time through which lens? From the person's perspective or from the perspective of the value that we're trying to deliver? It's just, it goes against the grain. It's so hard. It is a very uncomfortable truth.
Yeah, and if you think about it, for most companies, their employees are their most expensive resource. Like, if you look at the budget of most tech companies, what you will see is there is this huge amount of money spent on humans, and then everything else is just pennies compared to it. And if you think about like our most expensive resource has to be optimized. We need to optimize how we use that. But at the same time, there is this no, I see you saying that. But at the same time, what are you optimizing for? Them using their time for the most important thing, or them using their time? All of it. There is a very, very, very important difference there.
Totally. And this is where theory of constraints comes in, because instead of optimizing for utilization of that person's time, it's like you don't want to optimize for the most expensive resource. You want to optimize to address the bottleneck in the system. And the bottleneck in the system could be at the I'm going to call it the cheapest. So, for example, in some organizations that, incidentally, I consider this wildly dysfunctional. I do not support this at all. But in some organizations, particularly starting in like the 90s, they would have the very expensive engineers. And of course, we can't have the very expensive engineers doing work that is beneath them. We could hire cheap people somewhere else to go do the other things. And testing in particular was a thing that got outsourced a lot, because that's not where the real value is, right? The real value is in the brilliant work that the engineers are doing, and the testing, that's just making sure that it works right. That's not that. So we'll hire a very, very cheap, lowest bidder outsourcer to do that work. So now
Yeah.
testing is not the most expensive thing in the system. It's the cheapest, right? If you look at it on a per hour basis. So we're optimizing for the most expensive thing, but then that testing, that turns into the bottleneck in the system.
Yeah.
So, you elevate the bottleneck when you find it, and then everything else is in service to that, not to the most expensive part of the system.
So what's
Okay.
uncomfortable number 4?
You can't create culture through rules. And this hits my heart, is this is very much related to that whole, like, how do you adopt agile, top down versus bottom up, right? And
Yeah.
the whole idea of, as a manager, you cannot control a system. One of the systems that people want to be able to control is culture. So they make mission statements and the statements of culture. And how many times have you been in an organization where the actual culture inside the organization bears no resemblance to the statements of values that are on the recruiting page, right?
Oh,
So
wow. Yeah.
culture, it's organic. It grows, and it grows based on what you feed it. And if the actions inside the organization are not aligned with the statement of values, if the things that actually get fed in the organization are different, then you're going to end up with a culture that does not map at all to the statements of what the culture is.
Yeah, and honestly, that's kind of one of the things that I think a lot of people get wrong with agile and with DevOps. Like they think that these things are kind of sets of rules and colorful post-its and colorful pens. No, they are not. And they are not rules either. Like you can set up all the kinds of rules around what people do, unless you explain them why it is important. And unless you show them why it is important, it's not going to change the culture. And that's kind of, and by the way, that's one of the reasons when you look at my LinkedIn page, it doesn't say that I'm an agile coach. I'm not. I really should call myself an agile coach, but I don't want to call it myself that because I don't think that what I'm preaching is what most people think agile is. So I call myself an engineering culture advocate because what I want to do is advocate for certain engineering cultures. And the way I advocate for it is not by doing some kind of presentation, this is what you should do. No, I want them to feel it. I want them to experience it. And really this is the point of honestly, both of our work relates to this because what you do is you show people the consequences of the decisions that they are about to make. On the other hand, what I do is I put them in an environment, simulated environment that lets them experiment and lets them burn themselves with the decisions that they are about to make. So
I
to
love that.
create culture, you actually have to make people understand what you want to achieve, and that's hard.
Well, and also it's even then. So you've got a clear outcome of what you want to achieve. It's still hard to create the culture. The culture is, if we look at culture and how we can tell what is the culture in an organization,
Mhm.
anthropologists would tell us that the hallmarks of a culture include things like shared language and shared sense of humor and rituals. And these are all the things that you look for that are observable on the outside to help you understand what are the assumptions and unwritten rules, because that is what culture is. It's the assumptions that we make about what's true, and the unwritten rules, the things that nobody has to tell you because it's just in the air. And trying to
Mm.
figure out what that is from the outside, it's really hard unless you then look at, okay, well, how do people interact? What is the language they use? What are the rituals that bring them together, the things that they celebrate? And there's a whole long list of things that you can look at to tell you about the culture. And so even just having an objective doesn't necessarily change anything about the unwritten rules. It requires an attention to feeding the things that lead people to learn the unwritten rules that are aligned with what you want. So if you want a culture of collaboration, if you then have a stack ranked annual review process where people are competing and it's a zero sum game, and the only way for me to get a promotion is for you to not get a promotion, you're not feeding a culture of collaboration. Even though there's an outcome that sounds agile-ish, that is the statement of the outcome we want, there's still something that is feeding a culture of competition. Make
Yep.
sense?
It does. One of the worst things that can happen is leaders understanding that they don't want to create competition between their engineers. And then they decide that we are not creating a competition, so it's not a zero-sum game. And then they are not acting it. At least be honest, right? So either say that this is not a competition and then don't make it a competition, or make it a competition, but then accept that you have incentivized your people to act against each other. Because eventually people are going to catch on to this.
Turns
You
out people
might
are
be
really
able
smart.
to, yeah, I mean, guess what? You are hiring smart people, and if then you treat them as not smart people, that's gonna backfire. Big news there, right? So yeah, absolutely.
Sweet. That leaves us with what is uncomfortable truth number 5. Systems are living things, and you can iterate towards what you want the system to be, but it's always a process of iteration. I used to run a different simulation. This was an in-person one. It's called Word Count, and it involved code being written in English language on index cards and humans playing the role of the computer, executing the code. And I used this as part of an agile transformation simulation because throughout the course of the full day, the participants in the simulation would take control of their process. And I didn't present rules at all. I basically, after running it a few times, learned that I needed to step back and say, your process is yours. Your goal is make money. The more you can iterate, the faster you're going to be able to steer towards value, which is what the customer will pay for. And so every cycle, they were figuring out, how do we optimize? And what I learned from that, observing 150 groups go through this simulation, give or take. I mean, I ran it a bunch of times. And what I learned was that even if you took a group that knew nothing at all about Agile or DevOps or anything, if you gave them an environment in which they had the space to reflect and adapt, and you gave them a goal where they had to steer towards value, they would reinvent Agile. I had groups reinvent continuous delivery on index cards without ever having been introduced to what continuous delivery is. I had groups that ended up reinventing automated pipelines, and had groups reinvent effective source control practices with index cards, even when we weren't talking about branching strategies in the class at all. And we weren't talking about automated tests or pipelines or, any of that. They ended up reinventing it because they were iterating to get better, and they had the space to reflect and adapt. So basically what it boils down to is, if you want Agile, allow the system to iterate with regular, effective retrospectives and clear goals, and they'll get there.
I would rephrase then uncomfortable truth number 5. So
Yeah.
uncomfortable truth number 5 is that if you let people iterate and you let people improve on their processes, they will come up with a much better process than what you could on a paper.
Oh,
And
I love that.
this is something that is very empowering, and very scary at the same time. Because the scary part of it is that there is no way you can actually create a better system than by working together with people. And if the people you have are not motivated to do that, then you can do whatever. You're not going to get there. What you need is a motivated workforce that wants to improve. And then you need to give them the room to improve. And that's a very uncomfortable truth.
Oh, wait, but there's one more piece. So remember, I said you also need to have a clear goal. In the context of a simulation, the goal was very straightforward. I was the only customer in the room. I was the only one who had money. I had very clear requirements that did not change. There were no tricks. It was very simple. I had the acceptance tests in my pocket at the start of the day. Anybody who talked to me for any length of time would see me pull them out and start reading them. So the goal, really straightforward. But that is frictionless universe level straightforward. In the real world, our goals can actually be way more complex, conflicting even sometimes, because on the one hand, you've got big customer A who needs this thing and they need it right away, and the contract is at risk, and we got to do, but we had a longer term vision that was a little bit more over here, and we've got all of this market potential. And so figuring out where we're, what is business value? What would it mean for us to deliver value? And then within our, because it's probably a big organization that has a bunch of sub teams and functions and people with different managers, and different managers have a different idea of what good looks like. And so they've, this manager over here empowered their team. Their team is fully empowered. They're not engaged with the team that is dependent on them, but they're empowered. That's actually where leadership has to be able to step up, but it's actually harder. It's so much harder to be able to clearly figure out what we as an organization as a whole need to do and be aligned across that leadership level, so that we all say the same things, so that we would all reflect back the same priorities to the organization without creating an impossible situation of do both. You should be able to do both simultaneously. Why can't you do that? Right? That's not a goal. You can't empower people into violating laws of physics. that's not how this works.
Yeah.
You're empowered to
Yeah.
create teleportation. Go. Right,
Yes.
exactly. And so, I think you're
Great.
absolutely right. And this is what the entire book of Turn the Ship Around is about, is pushing the decisions to the people with information. But even then, within an organization, figuring out who actually has the right level of context to make a given decision, it turns out to be super hard. It's so easy to say, well, the people with information are the ones who have their hands on the keyboard. So I'm just going to say, we're going to, our goal is this revenue number. Oh, no, now there's this huge gap between the context that the people with their hands on the keyboard have. You can empower them all you want, but they don't have the full context of all of the business forces. And so there has to be an engaged set of communication channels through all the different parts of the organization to arrive at that goal, so we can iterate with our empowered teams to that. So hard.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. But also that kind of one more story I wanted to add here is I read a blog post from, I think, Ken Back, and it's a story of him explaining XP for the first time to someone. And that person coming back with, oh, I guess it's all fine if you don't know how to design software. And it was meant as a mean comment, right? But there is a different reading of this, which is, yes, we don't know how to design software. And let's assume that you know that how to design that software. Let's assume that you are the perfect architect. You know everything about software. And if someone gives you all the requirements, then suddenly you can design the perfect system. Problem is that the perfect system depends on the context. And the context tends to change. Requirements tend to change. Technology tends to change. The speed of the processor tends to change. So I guess what I want to get at here is like just this notion of we can design the perfect system on pen and paper is flawed, not just because none of us are perfect. Like no person can come up with perfect systems, even if they know all the requirements. But also, we don't know the requirements, and requirements change. So it is basically literally the perfect system that was the perfect system today is going to be a flawed system tomorrow.
Because everything is changing around us constantly, which is why those
Yeah.
learning loops are so critical. Oh, I so agree. Matt Marcom was right. We have so much to talk about.
Yeah, every time we have one of our calls, it feels like we could talk about so much more. If you look at the uncomfortable twos that we talked about, starting with time pressure and not being able to design the perfect system and all of these things that we talked about, I think really the most important learning here is that we need to be able to adapt, and we need to be able to steer. And I think maybe that is like one extra uncomfortable truth is that being able to steer the ship is always more important than the speed of the ship.
Oh, that is so profound. I want to repeat it. It's so profound. Being able to steer the ship is more important than the speed of the ship. That is so true.